Hi everyone, Dr. Josh Phillips here, and I want to make a quick video on a question that a student asked me about these sort of new hate speech policies that some of my students are starting to see in other classrooms. So my students in my introduction class just finished up some sections on free speech and the Constitution and John Stuart Mill, and we went through, what is and is not allowed on a public university's campus with regard to speech. I let my students know what they're allowed to say, um, what their rights are on a campus as far as speech in the classroom and speech outside of a classroom, but still on campus and protests and everything else. So we just did a whole exercise on this the last couple of weeks, and one of the questions my students brought to me that actually gave me pause was this question of whether or not it is allowed for professors to have some sort of hate speech policy in their syllabus. And the student kind of gave me a summary example of what that would look like. And I gave a brief, quick answer, but it actually took me a few days to think through as to why I answered the way I did. And I actually revisited it a few days later with my students and sort of walked them through some of the details um, and for some clarification and sort of where I've landed on this specific issue. So I'm just walk you through these sort of 5 points I walked my students through. And essentially, I kind of came to the conclusion that, hate speech policies in the syllabus, I don't think they're necessary and I don't like them. Whether or not they're allowed, I think is sort of kind of open to interpretation. We'll get to this issue of enforceability at the end. Um, but this is sort of what the student said as far as a summary, right? So if a syllabus has some sort of hate speech policy, public university hate speech policy might read as follows, this classroom is a safe space where racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, or other types of oppression will not be tolerated. Students who engage in hate speech will be asked to leave the class and may suffer a deduction in points. And so this was sort of broadly summarizes what my students were asking me about as to whether or not this sort of policy is allowed to be on a syllabus, or does this policy violate a student's free speech rights at a public university? So the first thing that I wanted to clarify with my students is, are we talking about speech or are we talking about discrimination? On the issue of discrimination, what I let my students know is that discrimination requires some sort of action. And so in the classroom, students can't really act with regard to some sort of policies towards each other, right? So the two things that are kind of really happening in this policy is kicking someone out of class or deducting points. Um, and students can't really discriminate against each other in that way. The professor's the only one who can ask a student to leave. The professor's the only one that has any charge over points. So it really is a speech question. It's not a discrimination question because students can't really discriminate against one another with regard to doing anything actionable in the classroom. So now you have this speech question. Is it allowed for students to say things that are essentially offensive and bigoted, hateful towards, in the classroom, right? Um, and so we start here. So the first thing I told my students is, it's a very weird question. It's a very weird policy for me because if it's up front in a syllabus, my first question to a professor who would do this is, what assumptions are we making about our students? I've been in teaching for around 16 years in the college classroom, and I couldn't think of an incident where a student was sort of blatantly being offensive and bigoted just for the sake of being offensive and bigoted. I did think of one instance several years ago where I had an 18-year-old freshman student who, when she was given her response, and it was in context, it was on topic, but she used, we'll call it an antiquated word that we don't use anymore. I'm not even going to tell you what it was around. Um, and she got through her remarks. She was very respectful in her remarks. She just didn't know that word wasn't used anymore. When she got done with her remarks, I let her know, this is an updated word for the word that you used with regard to this, a group of individuals with an identity marker. And she was very apologetic. She just said she didn't know. She had never heard this sort of new updated word. She only knew of the older word. And again, she's very apologetic. But that's the only time. So if we have some sort of syllabus with like up front, we're telling our students like hate speech won't be tolerated. I said to them, like, what sort of students do you have? Like, what assumptions are you making? Um, I let my students know, this would be like me having a policy in my syllabus that says, students are not allowed to be involved in physical altercations with each other during class. Um, it's true that you're not allowed to do that during class, but it's not in my syllabus because it's a very weird assumption I would make about my students about their, willingness to fight each other during a college course. I've never had it happen. I don't plan on ever having it happen, and I'm not going to put in a policy in my syllabus because it's so foreign to me with regard to it not happening. So this assumption that we need to sort of preemptively tell our students, don't be offensive bigots, is a very weird assumption that I don't think, I don't think it's warranted. Okay, the next thing I told my students about is this issue of range. And so these types of statements with regard to, like some sort of, diversity issues or being inclusive, they look really good, right? From the get-go, most people look at these types of statements and they say, yeah, these are good things. We want to be polite to each other. We want to tolerate differences. Not only that, but we want to be accepting. We don't even want these like sort of bigoted thoughts in people's heads. Like we're here to teach people to sort of, disabuse themselves of these ideas. And so on the surface, it seems kind of innocuous. Like, yeah, like, we shouldn't, say nasty things in the classroom. With this type of statement, though, if we kind of get into the nitty gritty of it, what the problem with it is, what's the range that the professor has in mind? I don't know what the professor thinks is racist, sexist, homophobic, or transphobic. Now, while it might not be enforceable, I think it might be, I could see where a professor would say, look, don't use offensive, bigoted slurs in the classroom, right? This is a pretty well-defined list that most people are going to know who grow up in an English-speaking culture. There's a pretty well-defined list of bigoted remarks, offensive remarks, slurs that people might use to describe other individuals. That whether or not it's enforceable to kick a kid out of class for using one of them, I think the students would at least know, like, hey, these are the list of things you're not allowed to say. So that's on one extreme. All right, where you get into some very, very murky area is this, sort of concept of microaggressions. So with microaggressions, these are, as many of you probably know, they're sometimes they're subconscious. Sometimes, people say things and maybe I didn't mean to be offensive, but somebody took it offensively. So it's in this sort of like gray area. It's not overt offensiveness, bigotry, etc. But it's sort of like an under the surface, covert, maybe I meant something different. It's like a dog whistle, right? We use these terms to describe, like, what I really mean, but I can't outright say my bigotry. However, when you get into this sort of like other end of what's considered racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, I thought of several examples where I was like, what? I don't know if I was a student in the class, I don't know if I'd be able to talk about it. So I would know, don't use slurs. Now, if you're in some sort of sociology, psychology class, you're talking about contemporary issues, specifically issues going through the court system. What if there's a debate on whether or not same-sex couples should be allowed to adopt? These are real issues that, currently the United States is dealing with and it's going through the courts. If I'm a student who doesn't think that same-sex couples should be allowed to adopt, am I allowed to say that in class, right, under this policy? Or would a professor say, look, that's homophobic of you to make these assumptions about same-sex couples, about, two men who want to be dads to an adopted child? I might get dinged for homophobia if I bring up opposition to same-sex couples and adoption. I can see where in a sociology class with regard to transphobia, if I'm a student in the class that says, look, I don't think trans women should be allowed to compete in female sports for these reasons. In this broad range of what constitutes microaggressions under this policy that is not very well defined, there's a question about whether or not a professor is going to say, yeah, like that's transphobic for you to assume these things about trans women athletes. With regard to sexism, if I'm in some sort of class, we're talking about feminism, specifically the history of feminism, and treating men and women equal. If I'm a student who says, yes, women and men should be treated equal under the law, but, I think it is a fool's errand to push women into STEM because maybe women would rather be in the humanities or in the social sciences for some sort of like inherent biological reasons. Men are more likely to choose the STEM field, women are more likely to choose the social science field. and maybe that's a good faith argument that a student could make. I could see a student making that argument. But again, under this broad sort of policy, does the professor sort of see that as sexism because I'm not recognized, because for my lack of recognition for men and women being the same, or being exactly equal as opposed to sort of treated equally. So all this comes down to, it's a very vague policy. I'm not really sure what these terms mean when they play out to actual language. All right. And so that gets me to number 4. So I wouldn't put this policy in my syllabus because I think ultimately it would have a chilling effect on students. So I do think most students want to be liked by their professors and they don't want points deducted. So I do think students are trying to do the best they can with regard to following the syllabus so they can get the grade so they can pass the class. They don't want to waste time, energy, and money on a class that they're going to fail. But under this sort of policy, you have a question of like, does a student risk saying something that might violate the rules? And if I'm a student who's like, look, I don't want to get kicked out of class, that's embarrassing. I don't want to have a deduction of my points because I'm going to fail the class. So if I do have a tightly held belief about transgender athletes, same-sex adoption, men and women differences with regard to career paths and choosing their major, if I have some sort of question or concern about that, and it's topical and it's within the context of the class, yeah, I would worry about students censoring themselves and just saying, no, I'm not going to risk bringing up a different viewpoint because my professor might say, you know what, that's covert sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. And so, am I going to get dinged for essentially bringing up a held belief I have or a question that I have about the topic? Yeah, I don't think, I think that would have a big chilling effect on students who just don't want to rock the boat because they don't want to suffer these consequences. And the final thing that I mentioned to my students is the question of enforceability. So the original question that the student asked was, is this allowed to be in the syllabus? And I came to the conclusion that it's probably allowed to be in the syllabus. I don't think a department chair is going to come around and exit out of the syllabus. Again, it's a good-looking policy. We don't want our students to engage in hateful speech. We don't want our students to say offensive and bigoted things in the classroom. We do want the classroom to be an environment where everyone feels included. But the enforceability issue is where might be a little dicey. So again, if a student gets up and starts yelling slurs at people, I think you could remove them from the class. But again, I've never seen that. So because I've never seen it, then it just becomes a question. It's like, well, then this policy is irrelevant. Like, why are we having this policy at all since it never happens? But if a student does bring up, some of the topics I brought up before, transgender athletes, same-sex adoption, and has a viewpoint that could be construed as homophobic, transphobic, and then the student is removed from class or loses points, I think the student might have a case to go to a department chair or a director of academic affairs and say, look, I was unfairly removed and this violated my ability to sort of speak freely and openly and ask, interesting questions and important questions about current topics that are happening in our world today. And I shouldn't, my grade shouldn't suffer because of these opinions that I had. I think a chair or a, academic affairs person would come in and say, yeah, this policy isn't enforceable because it's so broad. And so while I think it is allowable, I think a professor can put a policy like this in their syllabus. I think when it comes to enforcement, I don't see how it ends up being enforced in any sort of way that is consistent, that is in any way equitable for the students. You want to use those terms, fair to the students. I just don't see how it's enforceable. So again, to circle back, I just don't see students like doing hateful things in the classroom. Most students come in, they want to get a good grade and they like to leave, and they are, polite and are trying to get along with each other and their professor. So I don't know what assumptions that people are making about their students to put a policy like this in their syllabus in the first place. But I do think ultimately, like, number 4 is what worries me, to have this sort of preemptive conversation with your students to say this stuff's not going to be tolerated, and then we know that these sorts of terms, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, are being defined more broadly every day. I do think that there's going to be lots of students who are trying to work their way through current contemporary problems, who are afraid of hitting some speed bumps along the way. Um, and instead of speaking their mind about certain topics and trying to work through it, they're just going to say, you know what, maybe my topic is a little bit, or maybe what I'm going to say, some people might interpret it as hateful, so I'm just going to shut my mouth and not even ask questions about these topics, or make statements about these topics. And I think it just kind of ultimately is going to lead to some sort of chilling effect in the classroom, where students don't speak. And I would much rather have students say what they need to say. If I need to, correct them or help lead them to a different conclusion, or I need to, uh, you know, uh, ask them probing questions to help them sort of work out their conclusion in a different way, or make sure that their remarks are inclusive and their remarks are not discriminatory. Then that's my job as a teacher. But to put things, some sort of hate speech policy up front, that could ultimately have some sort of chilling effect on the classroom, where students just decide, you know what, I'm not going to speak, I think is a problem. So that's my whole thing. I don't like these syllabus policies that I'm starting to see around, hate speech in the classroom for these reasons. People should be nice to each other. You shouldn't be a bigot. um, but these sorts of policies, I think, are counterproductive to the long-term mission of the university.